I'd also like to start by acknowledging the traditional owners of lands right around Australia. And I say that because we have supporters joining us today right across Australia, which is really lovely. And I pay my respects to our traditional owners, elders past, present and emerging. Ramadan Mubarak, and welcome to our special guests today. Lilly Carlisle, External Relations for UNHCR in Jordan. Fadak Alfayadh, former Iraqi refugee. It sounds funny. We're going to talk a bit about that and what that means. A refugee advocate and a gun lawyer, I understand too, Fadak. You're a woman of many talents. And Peter Gould, Chief Design Officer of Zaleej Studio and a really wonderful Australia for UNHCR supporter who we've invited to talk about his role in supporting UNHCR through our current global Zakat campaign, as well as other things. So thank you everyone for joining us today, and thank you to our wonderful supporters. We couldn't do our work without your wonderful generosity. I'm very glad we can host this conversation today. This is what we call our Frontline Club is about, giving our supporters a chance, an opportunity to hear from people from the field, humanitarians, journalists, refugees, supporters, and many others. A little bit of housekeeping. If you have any questions for myself or any of our panelists today, please type them up in the Q&A function, and you'll be able to see that, I think, at the bottom of your screens if you have a look down there, and we'll try and get answered as many questions as possible. As we're in Ramadan right now, we thought it would be a really great time to shine a light on the refugee experience and what Ramadan might look like to many refugees. And of course, Muslim refugees in this holy month. This is especially so as many refugees and displaced people are marking Ramadan in acutely changed circumstances right now, as we all face the COVID-19 epidemic, and it's certainly changed our lives in Australia. But how has it changed lives for refugees living across the world right now, and also marking Ramadan? There are more than 70 million forcibly displaced people across the world right now, the most ever in history, a very sad fact. And those refugees and displaced people come from all corners of the globe. But of course, many of those do originate from Muslim countries, and it means a huge number of disrupted lives as a result. And of course, disruption is what we've been experiencing over the last few months to our work, to our lifestyles, our families, our celebrations, our plans. It's a taste of the upheaval, we might say, that many refugees face in their day-to-day lives. And today we're going to talk first off to Fadak, who's lived through that experience. Fadak, if I can't come to you as a former refugee, can you tell us what life was like before becoming a refugee? And as I understand, you were quite a young child at the time, and suddenly how you became aware that your life was going to change forever.
Thanks, Naomi, and thanks for having us today. I remember when I was 10 years old, when my life changed back when we were living in Baghdad. When everything changed for us in 2003. I had really beautiful memories of my home, my family back in Baghdad, and everything for us changed suddenly and overnight. I had a really big family. We were very family oriented. You know, on the weekend we would see cousins and grandparents, and you know, have big meals together and go to the parks together and play games. And I really liked playing soccer, so when I was young we would have street soccer with my cousins and children from the neighborhood. I was really competitive and I really enjoyed sport, particularly soccer, and playing it with my cousins. I remember going to my grandmother's house on weekends and just smelling the beautiful aromas of the food that she would be cooking. And I remember this flat bread, sweet bread that she used to make, which is sort of like a pancake. And whenever we would see her, me and my cousins would, beg her to make it for us. It was so delicious. And I just had really beautiful memories of being surrounded by my family. Both my parents were doctors. So my mum was a dentist and my dad was a surgeon in Iraq. So we had a pretty good life. And it wasn't until things changed in 2003, but a couple of years before that, when my dad had to run away from Iraq, is when our lives changed a little bit, but then we tried to go back to normal. So in the late 90s, my dad was conscripted to join Saddam Hussein's army as an army surgeon or an army doctor, which he refused to do, and he ran away from the country, in defiance of joining the army, because obviously that would mean that he would potentially have to commit abhorrent acts against everyday Iraqis. So that's when my dad left Iraq, and things changed for us then, because all of a sudden my dad had disappeared, and we were obviously living in a dictatorship. So the political situation was heavily controlled around us, and we couldn't really talk about it. We couldn't call him, but eventually he made his way to Australia, and that was the link for how we arrived here. But we did have a pretty good life back in Iraq. There was never a reason for why we wanted to leave. I mean, everything was going well. Me and my sisters, we went to school, and we were surrounded by a beautiful family and friends who when we had to leave, we couldn't see them anymore. And we had no idea that we couldn't see them again. We thought that leaving Iraq would only be a temporary solution, and that we would be able to go back and be reunited with family. But it was never something that was on the cards for us. Even when we were living, when the invasion began in early 2003, it wasn't an option for us to leave Iraq. We always wanted to stay and find ways of making it work. But it did become unbearable and unlivable in terms of the safety, or the lack of safety, and the spread of lawlessness around the country that forced us to flee. But I have beautiful memories of my life there. We're talking about Ramadan now. It's such a beautiful time amongst family and friends, and being able to visit each other. And every day is different, and every day you meet some new relatives, or be surrounded by people who look like you and talk like you. And it's just a big, beautiful community, which we really do miss. Naomi, you're still on mute.
There we are. Thank you. Just made a very interesting intervention, which nobody.
I'm sure it was.
Brilliant, brilliant. Fadak, I was just saying, sort of coming to Australia, then you've just touched on it, the sort of difference. One was sort of coming from a very sort of close community with lots of sort of daily interaction, I suspect, with family and friends and whatever. And one, because they're not with you here necessarily, but two, it's a different culture here. What was it like coming to Australia and those early days here?
Yeah, I didn't speak a word of English, so people were around me asking me things and trying to be friendly and talking to me, and I had no idea what they were saying. The first interaction I had was with like an airport official, maybe a customs officer, I don't remember. And at the time, because we had escaped from Iraq, there was no government, so we couldn't get passports, and we fled without the appropriate documents. So when we got to Australia, my mum was talking to one of the officers, and so someone else came to look after us because we were all children. And I remember this really friendly Australian official. I don't remember his name or what he was saying to me because I didn't understand, but he was so animated and lovely and nice. And I guess that culture difference of being really out there and really animated is I thought it was a very Australian thing, and it was like a big introduction to Australian culture of just having someone who's so nice and kind and very welcoming, and that was my first interaction with an Australian, and the first Australian I met, and it was a beautiful interaction too, and a reflection of the rest of the community in Australia. But aside from that, it was a big shock because I didn't speak the language. Back in Iraq, we started to learn some of the letters and the numbers. So that was the biggest shock for me, is learning a whole new language. And being in school where everybody spoke English and spoke English so well and so confidently, I thought I would never be able to pick it up. It sounded so difficult. I kept making mistakes, and for years I kept making mistakes, and I thought I would never get the hang of it. But you know, times have changed, and I now speak English well. But aside from that, it's been a really beautiful experience to be amongst the Australian community. What I love about being in Australia is the diversity. I never felt like it was a cultural shock because it was, you know, obviously the landscape is different and the community works differently, but you can find your own community, or you can build your own community, and find people who you can, you know, live amongst, which is a beautiful thing about Australian communities.
And you chose law as a path. Why did you choose that profession, and how's that helped you, I guess, in what you've been a sort of tremendous advocate for refugees here in Australia?
My journey with law began when I was quite young. So my dad's family were very much against, or were a part of the opposition against like Saddam Hussein's party. So I always grew up around relatives who were, you know, activists. So I heard from them, you know, about why they were doing what they were doing, and a lot of it was about, you know, finding justice and equality for everyday Iraqis. And at the same time, my mum, she was a big community leader in our town, and you know, everybody looked up to her. So I saw her generosity and kindness on a daily basis. So I was able to kind of grow up around those values, you know, values of fairness and justice and kindness and generosity for people in my community. So these values were resonated with me very early on in my life. So I remember when I was choosing my subjects and thinking about what I wanted to do, a big thing that stood out for me was law, because it's a powerful tool in Australia, where there is the rule of law. There is a lot of respect for the rule of law, and you can go a long way with having a law degree. And I really wanted to be able to use it to empower others, to change, create big or lead big change campaigns or agencies, and change some of the law to support the issues and causes that I cared about. So law was a natural choice for me, because I always grew up with those values of justice and fairness for people. And it's been a massive journey. I mean, I've worked with people from all over the community. Obviously worked with a lot of refugee and migrant communities, but I've worked in preventative legal education, where I've worked with community members around teaching them about their rights and obligations. including, you know, when interacting with police, or when interacting with the justice system, or when having fines. I worked with people who are experiencing homelessness, and I was able to work as part of a big team where we secured some public housing for them, and I worked on part of a legal team to amend the Migration Act, where at the time doctors and medical officials were not allowed to speak about all the abuses that were happening inside detention centres. So I feel like I've used my degree quite well, and obviously more recently working with your organisation and the UNHCR in representing refugees globally, which has been a massive journey.
And just on that, Fadak, you were one of, I think it was 2 refugee representatives nominated by the Refugee Council and peers to attend, I think it was the year before last, the UN Refugee Dialogue in Geneva.
It was last year, 2019.
Last year.
Yeah.
Thank you. What month was that? What was it?
It was in June. Yeah, it's almost a year ago. Yeah.
Time flies, doesn't it? But, you know, and Australia for UNHCR was one of your supporters there, because we, of course, believe it's really important to have refugee voices there. But what was that experience like, and what were you actually doing in Geneva there on our behalf, all our behalf?
Well, it was a beautiful trip because it was my first time going to Europe. So it was very exciting on many fronts. But I really wanted to, and I feel very strongly about refugee communities, speaking about issues that affect and impact them, and being part of global conversations. And slowly Australian organisations are, you know, what I found out when I was in Geneva is are one of the leading countries who support refugees to self-represent on a lot of issues. So a big part of the journey was gathering some information and engaging and consulting with refugee stakeholders here in Australia and the Middle East around some of the issues that they wanted to raise or they wanted to talk about at a global platform and at such an important event. So I spent a good part of early 2019 talking to refugee communities and stakeholders. You know, I spoke to a lot of young people who were living in Australia who were struggling with finding work and struggling with finding security in terms of their visa status, struggling with English and struggling with discrimination and racism that they were experiencing in school or at work. And I consulted with other stakeholder groups as well, including different communities from Iraq, like the Yazidi community and the Kurdish community here around some of the issues they experience. And more recently, obviously, the Yazidi community was impacted and still is. And the events in Geneva were, there were a number of events. But obviously the main event was was the consultations that the UNHCR was holding with non-governmental organisations, where they had a range of topics and they wanted to hear from us. And there were a number of advocacy meetings where we were meeting with senior UNHCR officials and we could advocate on specific issues, bring some issues to their attention. And some of the things that we were able to bring up were some of the issues that were happening at detention centres offshore, which was an issue I felt really strongly about, and I still do, around some of the conditions that people are experiencing in offshore detention centres. So it was just fantastic to be able to bring local issues to a global and international platform where people from all over the world were there, listening and taking part in these conversations. At the same time, the Human Rights Council was on, UN headquarters. So it was nice to be able to sit into some of these sessions and, you know, as a lawyer, hearing some of the human rights abuses that were being brought to the council, and some of the investigations that were being carried out for, you know, a number of years on specific topics and issues, including the rights of women globally, which, you know, just fantastic. And there were some key people that I have always looked up to and got to meet, including, I remember seeing the Prime Minister of Iceland, and, you know, she's seen as someone who's very progressive and on many fronts, including, you know, women's rights, and the Green movement. So it was just fantastic to be able to see her in action, and seeing such a global female leader as well. And obviously hearing from Filippo Grandi at the start of the consultation sessions, and just amazing to see someone who's done massive work for the international community and refugees in person.
I'm going to come back to you, Fadak, because I want to talk about Ramadan, but I also want to talk about resilience and refugees and what we might learn from that experience for our own lives now. But I'm going to come to you, Lilly. Lilly Carlisle, as I've said, is External Affairs Officer based in Oman, Jordan. Fascinating career. Worked for UNICEF previously, worked in Tripoli, Libya, speaks fluent Arabic, which I would love to do, so I'm very jealous of that. But of course, you know, as one of our colleagues in UNHCR, I'm sort of always very proud of the work that you do, but particularly now, I know our High Commissioner has spoken about this principle of stay and deliver. So 80% of UNHCR staff work in the field, and they've remained there at this time. I just think it's something that makes this organisation, at least to us who support it, very special. Lilly, could you talk about the situation in Jordan, which I was there in 2012 or 13, just with the first wave of Syrian refugees coming through. We're now in what, our 9th, 10th year of that situation. Talk about what's happening there for Syrian refugees, and of course other refugees, you know, who are also being hosted by Jordan, a very generous country to refugees. And then we'll talk about what's happening right now in Ramadan. Thank you.
Hi everyone. Great to be able to join you from here in Amman, and it was also really interesting to just hear Fadak's story, because I think many of the parts which she was talking about resonate from what I hear from refugees here in Jordan. Many of the refugees here come from middle class backgrounds. They owned their own homes previously. They were doctors, teachers, very normal professions that we would all recognise in everyday lives, and then suddenly had all of that taken away from them when they had to flee. But just in terms of statistics, here in Jordan we have about 750,000 refugees. 650,000 of them are from Syria, and 100,000 are from other nationalities. So that's places like Iraq, Yemen, Sudan and Somalia are the main ones. But in total, there's about 52 nationalities of refugees who have kind of found their way to Jordan over time. But I think probably what's quite interesting is that the majority of them live in normal towns and cities. I think often people have this stereotype that refugees live in refugee camps, but here in Jordan, that's not the case. Only 20% of the refugees live in the two main camps, which are Zatari camp and Azraq camp. The rest of the time, they're essentially my neighbours. They live just around the corner. I have some Syrian refugees who actually live next door, and kind of they all have to deal with similar circumstances that everyone does, whether that's paying their rent or paying their water and electricity bills, and that's kind of where UNHCR is here to try and support them.
And could you talk about the specific work that UNHCR is doing in supporting refugees on a daily basis in Jordan, and some of the I think the really important programs like the cash assistance program?
Yeah, definitely. As you mentioned, we have a variety of programs, including cash assistance, health, education, protection, which is kind of a bit vague, but that includes counselling for those who've maybe experienced violence, provision of legal aid, supporting those who might have disabilities. We also have a really large community-based protection team, which run around 25 community centres across Jordan. Obviously now coronavirus has hit, all those community centres have had to be closed, so we've been looking for alternate ways to try and deliver our services. Actually, yesterday was the first day of our Corona emergency cash assistance distributions to around 18,000 refugee families here, which is amazing because so many people have lost their livelihoods as a result of the coronavirus. Obviously, this is a public health emergency, and we have also been supporting the government of Jordan and the Ministry of Health by donating money so that refugees can continue to be included within the national health system. But alternatively, we did a survey which was actually published last week, which showed that about a third of refugees here in Jordan have lost their jobs completely because of the coronavirus. They were very much reliant on the informal economy before. And also over 90%, which is quite shocking, of refugees say that they have no savings left. So in general in Jordan, they've been very strict with the coronavirus precaution measures. There's been a number of complete lockdowns where you're not allowed to leave your homes for days, just to prevent that contact and the spread, which has worked. But for refugee families who don't have savings, they don't have the money to go to the supermarket and buy the food that they need to kind of last them through that lockdown period. And so this is why our cash assistance program is kind of more important than ever, to kind of support the families who might have lost their jobs, but also give them some savings so they can pay for those basic needs. When I talk to refugees who get this cash assistance, the majority tell me that they do use it to pay for rent, to pay for their electricity and water bills, because otherwise they have no other means of doing that and risk being evicted by their landlords. I think in terms of the protection sphere, which is obviously UNHCR's main mandate, coronavirus has kind of forced us to readapt our programs, whether that's delivering counselling more remotely through phones, online, through Zoom conferences like this, but also having precautions when we do our home visits. So last week, actually, I followed one of the teams to the house of a Syrian refugee family who have a 15-year-old son called Wassam, and he's got cerebral palsy. But when we were walking there, they live on the top floor of like a 7-floor apartment building, which has no lift. So obviously for Wassam, who doesn't really have much mobility, he's stuck at that top of that 7th floor apartment for the last month and a half, and he can't move. And normally what happened was teams would go in 3 times a week to deliver special education, to also physiotherapy, to kind of get him up and about. And he would also go to one of the community centres for 1 day a week to kind of socialise and see his friends. But because of coronavirus, all those services have stopped. The community centres are closed, and for a month, because of the limitations of movement, the teams couldn't get to him and his family to deliver the education on the physiotherapy. So it was really nice to be able to see them as they went to visit him for the first time. Like, he had such a big smile on his face, and was Mariam, who's the lady who normally goes and visits him 3 times a week, she was also really happy to see them again, and kind of all gave them a kind of a big hug, but keeping social distancing and made sure that they were back to normal a little bit. So I think it's those kind of personal relationships which really make the job worthwhile here in Jordan.
Can you, obviously everyone's experiencing Ramadan very differently to previous years. What are you kind of seeing out there, how people are able to market this year?
Yeah, definitely. So the majority of our refugee population here in Jordan is Muslim. And last year, was actually my first Ramadan here in Jordan, and it was amazing. I was invited to iftars every evening, whether that was like from my neighbours on a more personal level or through work with refugees at the community centres. We hosted, every community centre hosted a big iftar a week for all the people who live nearby. And I remember one in particular, I think there was probably about 200 refugees in attendance, all from different nationalities like Syrians, Iraqis, Sudanese. And as UNHCR, we'd also organised for like a couple of local celebrities to go and be a part of the occasion. And there was a local singer called Omar Abdallah, and he brought his guitar. So after the iftar, like everyone just sat around in a big circle and singing his songs. And the event was supposed to end at 9 p.m. in the evening, but it carried on for a long time after that. And it was lovely. But obviously this year is very different. As in the rest of the world, I think big gatherings are not allowed. In Jordan, we have a curfew which starts at 6 p.m. and everybody has to be in their houses by that time. Iftar at the moment is about 7:30, so people are just having their iftar with their close families and not being able to see their family and friends during that time. But also for refugees, like some of the people that I visited over the last month or so have said that they're just not having the extravagant meals or aren't able to afford the big meals, big breaking fast that they did last year because of the financial situation, because of the loss of livelihoods. Instead, they're just having simple meals. But I think especially for some mothers, they're a bit worried about that. Like after fasting all day, they need the nutrients and they need a proper meal to be able to last them through the month. But they're just not able to do that and they're cutting back, and it's a bit difficult to see really, but they're having to make these choices between whether to pay their rent or face being evicted or have a big iftar meal. So yeah, that's what they're choosing to do in these circumstances. But hopefully this emergency cash will help. And I know you were talking a little bit about the Zakat campaign before, but for our cash assistance program, a lot of that funding does come from Zakat donations, which is amazing, and it does really help the lives of refugees here.
Thanks, Lily, and that's a really lovely segue to Peter, because I think, you know, and our High Commissioner has sort of emphasised, you know, that this is not a pandemic, is not a refugee issue, it's a health issue. But as I think you've highlighted, Lily, it's very much a socio-economic issue now, and really with sort of limited livelihoods, and, you know, some refugees, many in fact, are facing very dire circumstances right now. Peter, you've been really instrumental, and thank you for raising awareness around the situation of refugees this Ramadan. What inspired you personally to be so passionate, as I've seen you, and committed around this issue?
Well, thanks, Naomi, and thank you everyone for joining in and listening. Really appreciate everyone's time, and especially listening to Fadak and Lily. You know, both doing incredible work, and I feel I'm really the odd one out here. I'm just trying to, I think if I go back to what inspired me early on is, I was very fortunate and blessed to travel a little bit around the Middle East, you know, maybe 10 years ago or more. Every year I would save up, and I was trying to learn Arabic, and you know, I'd love to go and meet different Muslim communities. And in particular, I absolutely loved my time in Syria. I spent some time in Damascus and Aleppo and other parts of the country, and just really fell in love with the people, and meeting so many generous families and lovely kids on the street, and having these great exchanges. You know, I was just there as a tourist, and you know, my wife and I just visiting out of, you know, interesting to see to learn the history and culture, and try delicious foods. I mean, to this day, I mean, I'm fasting right now. I'm thinking, oh, I could really go some of that Syrian halab right now, halabia. But that was really just, even though it was only a short time, it really resonated with me, that experience, meeting those families, individuals, and, you know, lots of little individual interactions and stories, and remembering particular people and faces and families. And of course, this is a couple of years before the war, the devastating war that, like you said, is now going towards its 10th year, which is just, you know, staggering to think about. And so my interest really, I think, grew from just that personal experience and coming back to Australia, and also I'm working a bit in Dubai, where you know, my team is a little bit as well, and just sort of, you know, thinking of that experience and how things have really unfolded, unfortunately, just, you know, so negatively for many Syrian families, and just hearing from Lilly there, like over 600,000 Syrian families, I think or 600,000, I mean, you know, that's phenomenal. And we here in Australia can't really, I think, fathom or quite imagine that scale in that way, maybe. But we can all contribute, and we can all, you know, find a way to be helpful and support people like Lilly and people like Fadak and Naomi and everyone on the call is finding a way to help. So I think it was why in particular UNHCR and Australia UNHCR, it was getting to know some of the individuals who just really care and are really, you know, dedicated a lot of time and their career and their effort into, you know, really serving these communities and these people and these families, and hearing those stories from Lilly and talking about Wissam on the 7th floor. I mean, you know, think of the other million stories there are, and we're so blessed and fortunate every single day being here in Australia, where I am right now. And so that's where it was just being able to, in a small way, try and support those efforts.
Peter, for those of us not so familiar with zakat, could you explain what that means? And I guess you've been very involved with UNHCR, you know, at various different points about what we're trying to do there. If you could talk about that for a moment, please.
Yeah, sure. So Muslims are you know, encouraged regularly to give and to donate, and in fact, a core pillar of what we're asked to do every year is to donate a certain percentage of our wealth to the needy, and there's quite specific recommendations of the kinds of people that we should be giving to. You know, you can't just donate to you know, your co-worker to help buy them a new PlayStation. No, it's very specific on you know, the categories, and of course, you know, there's many clear needy families, you know, that have been clearly designed as recipients for the UNHCR zakat. It was like, for example, a report that was that particularly impressed me that came out a few months ago, looking at the 1 million+ people that have benefited directly from zakat. I think that in particular, I think looking at the volume and scale of Muslim families that benefit from that zakat charity. So effectively, it's an annual charity, but it's often timed with Ramadan. So a lot of people like to give it at this time of year, which is what we're experiencing at the moment. And you know, I thought was a good time, and just to highlight some of the great efforts that are being made, and looking at how, you know, UNHCR is taking particular detail and attention to those families and how to distribute zakat. And yeah, it was that report, if anyone's interested, is quite impressive and comprehensive. And that was one thing that I had seen launched in Dubai with meeting some of the team there, and incredible people doing that work. And you know, it's just really, it's really about giving, and but making sure that we you know, take the time to give and allocate certain amounts is where that zakat comes from.
Because maybe, you know, I'm sort of putting the question on you, but it's interesting to me. It's sort of a fairly new initiative for UNHCR, although the reality is people under our care for many years have come from countries, you know, with large Muslim populations. Well, as I was saying, many countries, but including those. How do you understand it's got this impetus now, I guess, within UNHCR and many of the Islamic organisations that it's working with across the world, who really supporting it?
Yeah, well, I think just having that focus, if you look at, you know, just the types of communities that UNHCR is supporting, and just looking at, you know, globally, there is this annual importance of giving that's emphasized, and this time around Ramadan is, you know, picking up on that spirit of giving. So I think looking at how UNHCR is being able to, it has the data, you have the systems, the infrastructure, you have the teams, and really trying to, being a magnet for highlighting that that need. I think it was really incredible, and it's a team effort. There's lots of people in different great organizations that I've seen and been connected with that are contributing. But I think particularly Australia has an important role to play with that. Where I think we have today the first time 0 cases reported. I think I saw a headline. And although but many of us are lucky, we've got our devices and our Wi-Fi, and of course so many amazing blessings that we so it's sort of like there's an Arabic word amana, right, which is like a trust. And I kind of feel like we've been given this trust, this we have these blessings, so how can we serve the people that are really needing that? And I think zakat is one way that makes sure we do that. But just charity, whatever you can give. In the campaign that we going in our community at the moment, I think we have over 1,000 donors we just reached, and some of them were giving from just a few dollars here and there, but it really I'm hoping that will make a difference in the lives of people like Wessam and many others in Jordan, wherever they might be.
And how do people then give if they want to? Is it through sort of community giving or individual giving? Do they come to our website?
Yeah, that's it. How they reach is I think probably there'll be some links, but they can go straight through. I think there's a Australia for UNHCR site link that will go up there, or wherever people are normally donating. But we also have a particular campaign that I've been running, just trying to convince people around me that although there's many needy causes right now and many great places to contribute, this is in particular a good one. And I vouch for the people that I've met on the ground doing great work, and going to this site and just contributing whatever we can is an excellent thing to do, and a lot of blessings, especially to do it this time of year. Whatever your background or your faith, doing it in this time of year around Ramadan, a lot of families will appreciate it. So that would be great. Great, we can all contribute.
Thank you.
Oh, I think you're still on mute. Sorry, Naomi, go ahead.
Thank you. We've just got 5 minutes left. So mindful of that, I've got a couple of questions, but Fadak, while we've got that time, I just sort of again remind people, if you do want to ask a question, please do by going to your chat button down the bottom. But one of the questions has come in, Fadak, in light of your experience advocating for people in detention, about what UNHCR is doing, but also I'm also interested in, I guess, your hopes or optimism about whether Australia will be able to change its policy. We've got people in hotels at the moment quarantined in Melbourne. And I should say, as you know, UNHCR constantly advocates on behalf of those in detention. Its policy is very clear. People should only be in detention for a limited time for security reasons and whatever, and then should be released into the community, or their status normalised. But you're very much at the grassroots there. How do you see, will there be progress, I guess, Fadak?
Difficult question, Naomi, although it's always good to have hope. I can imagine that a lot of people are feeling like the precariousness of the situation is infinite, and for a lot of people who have been in detention centres and now are being put in hotels or around Melbourne, maybe the environment and landscape is changing, but obviously their limits to their freedoms is still there, which is just heartbreaking to see. My family was lucky enough to not have to experience being in a detention centre, and I can only imagine what the hurt is like for a lot of people. So I can only imagine what that's like. I think people in the community, I encourage any advocates to keep going and to not let the fight go. I think it's important to continue to advocate for people to live amongst the community, and it's amazing just to hear how well it's going from Lilly in places like Oman, where refugees are living amongst us, and I think that's how it should be until they are able to go back home or are able to decide to stay permanently or go to a third country. I want that to be the ideal solution for us and for Australia, for people seeking asylum to be amongst us in the community whilst their claims are being processed, because it does take a very long time. For those advocating, I thank you and I encourage you to keep going. I think, like Naomi said, the UNHCR has been doing some work around this in the advocacy space, and also the Human Rights Commission, particularly around detention centres, offshore detention centres. So keep going, keep advocating, keep asking questions. The situation won't get better without you. Don't lose hope, and I'm available if you want any support or advice.
Thanks, Fadak. And of course, we should remember that Gillian Triggs, the former head of the Australian Human Rights Commission, who was such a great advocate on behalf of people in detention, is now the Assistant High Commissioner for Protection for UNHCR globally. So we certainly have the best of people there to try and make a difference. Just two more questions, and I'm going to go to Lilly and Fadak. Lilly, in your working with refugees, what lessons do you take right now that might be helpful from people who have been so resilient?
I think it's definitely just to appreciate the little things and the small things, especially at this time where we're not really allowed to travel or move too far because of coronavirus. It's just things like speaking to your family. For me, that's on Zoom or in person, or spending more time with the people you love. Cooking nice meals. I was just mentioning before actually that last night my Syrian neighbours, they did a big barbecue for their iftar and they brought me a massive plate of food and asked me to come and join them and share in those experiences. So I think it's just trying to take this opportunity to speak to more people, to learn new things, to kind of open our minds a little bit more about what's out there in the world.
Mm-hmm. I think the difference. Yep. The big difference in Australia is that, detaining people seeking asylum is part of the process and part of the law, which I don't think is the case for Jordan. So it'd be a long way to go to try and change that. But it sounds like a really good model.
Mm-hmm. And Fadak, while you're there, what would you say to people here, like, struggling with children, home education, lots of the sort of technology issues, not being able to meet grandparents, separated between states and between countries, in some cases, families. What lessons can we take from refugees? For many of us, because that's happening to us now, how do we cope?
Yeah, it's a big lesson in resilience, actually, and it's a big test of character as well. I remember when we were preparing my house for the invasion in 2003, and my mum had brought a lot of non-perishable food items like bags of rice and cans of beans to store around the house. And in March, when people were hoarding items, it reminded me of that. Obviously, there was no shortage of food, so people didn't need to do that. But it's the same sort of panic, and people did or were afraid about not having food or access to food. But I would say that we are very lucky. We live in a country where there is food is available for most people. It is accessible for most people, and I think that we should keep that in mind and think of some of the beautiful messages that Peter spoke to about how blessed we are. have access to so many things, and to not be in such a dire situation when it comes to the coronavirus. But I would say to people in the Australian community, have a look at the resilience that refugee communities all over the world have experienced, including not being able to travel between countries to see family because of visa restrictions, or you know, like the people who are being detained in our community at the moment, who can't leave their homes or leave where they're placed, but also you know, specifically the restrictions around not leaving your house as well, where if you're living in a situation of war or conflict, that would be something you wouldn't want to do. So I think let's look at refugee communities and you know, be inspired by them, and look to them for some you know, values of strength and resilience.
Yeah, thank you, Fadak, and being such a great advocate. You've chosen those beautiful words to end our briefing on today. So thank you. Thank you to Lilly, Peter and Fadak. I sincerely appreciate all of you taking the time out to talk to us. And thank you for everybody who's joined us today for our Frontline Club. Combating this health emergency in refugee communities requires, as we know, a huge global effort. In times like this, it's really important that we do look out for each other, and particularly the most vulnerable amongst us. And we know refugees certainly are the most vulnerable amongst us, some of those worldwide. So thank you for standing with refugees at this critical time. If you do want to find out more about UNHCR's work supporting refugees, or how to support our zakat and campaign during Ramadan, please go to our website, unrefugees.org.au/Ramadan. And finally, I would just like to, again, to wish everybody Ramadan Kareem. Thank you so much.